Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion today at the Innovation at Work Economist Impact Series. Today, we're going to be talking about digital transformation at work, how it started, and where it's going. I'm your moderator for the session. I'm Vaibhav Sehgal, a principal on our Americas team, Policy and Insights at Economist Impact. I'm joined by our four panelists today: Dex Grant, the Global Chief Information Officer, founder and chief executive officer at Global Transform; Cheryl Levin, field chief technology officer EMEA at Citrix; Sanjeevan Bala, group chief data and AI officer at ITV PLC; and Thomas Muller Lebeck, human resources process innovation director at the Lego Group. So just starting off with a quick introduction to what we're going to try to investigate today. Started accelerated by pandemic impacts, digital transformation has definitely become one of the foremost industry priorities globally. In fact, today I might even say that it has become an industry in itself. The phrase digital transformation, however, has also become a bit of a catch-all. So, in order to actually achieve the promise of digital transformation as a driver of post-pandemic recovery, it's integral to avoid misinterpretation and subsequent misapplication. So, just level setting at the top of this discussion, our kind of working definition for digital transformation here is the adoption and utilization of digital technologies to improve business processes, culture, value for customers, and ability to innovate. For meaningful impact, of course, these strategies should be well designed, targeted, and ideally mission led. Without further ado, let's get into the discussion today. The first area of discussion really is, um, there is a lot of talk about whether or not digital transformation has been able to live up to the hype. My first question to the panel is, whether digital transformation is actually delivering significant business value. Sanjeevan, maybe you want to get us started.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting opener, actually. I think a lot of the conventional literature will talk about how successful transformation will deliver anything between 15 and 20% EBIT improvements to your bottom line. And that's a phenomenal number. But I think all too often, a number of the programs fail to sort of either initiate correctly, deliver correctly, or sustain that sort of change, really. If you were to look at the sort of the first part, it's all around how do you reimagine your business? How do you think about the value you create for all of your stakeholders? So that's the city, your employees, producers, your customers, and having a total picture of value, taking that value statement to your CFO to get funding and board buy-in. The second phase, I think, is what you might call redefine. So how do you actually deliver that value? And increasingly, it's not about tech, it's not about the data, it's really about how your colleagues feel and that level of employee engagement. So it's moving from that logical, rational reason for a transformation program much more to that sort of emotive value. And then the last stage, which often you don't often see correctly done, is what I'd call that sustain phase. So how do you ensure that the change is sustained, so that that's an ongoing cadence of innovation that's driving in the organization? And often what you see is a lot of these programs come in loud and fast, like a firework, but disappear just as quickly. So how do you ensure it's a reliable, slow-burning fire that continues throughout that? And I think those are the three stages that you often see organizations fail in or trip up in. And that then causes issues with the transformation program that then delivers that value.
I think some really good points in there. And I think one of the areas that I often come across is maybe an inability to discern between modernization and real transformation as well. So that when we're basically just doing the same thing, but doing it with slightly different technologies without really trying to change the outcomes, that's often, given the tagline of transformation where there's no transformation, actual outcomes from it. I think the other really good point that Sanjuvan made there was it's very easy to start. Well, maybe it's not that easy, right? You still have to make the business case. You have to get the funding. You have to keep the stakeholders involved. But it's the sustained outcome, really seeing this through to its logical ends, getting your employees engaged, making sure that it's showing real returns. I think that's where many people struggle. And that's where having something at the beginning that actually defines an outcome that isn't just modernizing technology, but is really changing the business. That's key.
A quick follow up to the both of you and the panel in general. So, there has been, I guess, there has been arguments, of course, against this kind of targeted approach as well, which is that if companies adopt, or experiment with and adopt a wide variety of technological capabilities, digital capabilities, tools, etc., then maybe casting the net wide allows them to respond very quickly when a strong use case is identified, and therefore gain business value. So at this point, it's just really strategic value, as they call it. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this type of approach for the more kind of for the larger firms with a ton of resources?
You know, we've already talked about the client, the consumer being at the heart of this. So really, really important that we start there. A lot of organisations dive into the middle, but really understanding that outside in experience is absolutely key. Now, in bringing the organisation together, this requires a lot of enterprise-wide leadership. And whilst we look at the customer and consumer view, make sure the client is, getting the value as well as the corporation getting the value. There is also, an opportunity to, in the nicest sense, ring fence a small group to look at new technologies. And it's important that new technologies are well understood and the benefits that they bring are also understood. And often, in some of the organisations that I've worked in, what we do is bring together a bit of a collab where, the benefits of these new technologies are showcased with folks that really understand the customer and client value. And often there is then a synergy between the two, but always we would start with the customer and client view and then look at how the technology fits. But, distributed ledger, other new technologies, they offer a new way of approaching the tech stack. But technology strategy is always subservient to the business strategy. So one always leads the other.
Agreed with Dax. And to your point, I think allowing innovation and experimentation is good, but it's vital. But there has to be an outcome to begin with, or a target to move towards. I think as a technologist myself, and I'm someone who works with a lot of people in technology. We love technology, but it doesn't necessarily create change in and of itself, or it creates a lot of change, but it doesn't necessarily create constructive outcomes. So I think having a target, having something to run towards, not falling into what is the marksman's fallacy of where you draw the target after you've achieved some kind of outcome. I think that's very important.
So we've been briefly kind of touching on good practice or the right process, but just based on your experience, maybe could you give us a little bit of guidance around um, you know what is a meaningful process architecture in terms of how firms should be designing and implementing digital transformation strategies? Dax, maybe you want to get us started because you briefly touched on this.
Yes, of course. And again, I mean, there is always the technology architecture, but there are many different types of architecture, and there are many sort of architectural models. But again, it's coming back to the business view and understanding where the value really sits. And so, the most effective organisations have two types of architectural conversation. One is more of a technology piece, but actually looking at the enterprise-wide architecture, that's absolutely key. And being able to combine and catalyze the skills of really world class architectural enterprise architects with folks that lead the business lines, are accountable and empowered for the P&L, and folks that are maybe in the call centers or in some of the frontline roles, and really combining those to understand what the blueprint of an organization is absolutely key. And being able to do that early on and in earnest is important, but also being very clear about the culture that's required to to actually catalyse that conversation is absolutely key. And that's why, one of the areas that I work very heavily in is working with FTSE and Fortune boards, looking at how this is all set up. And really, there is an empowerment that comes through the firm, but the organisations that really have that board level vision and have that sponsorship from the CEO are the ones that will drive that digitisation very effectively in the marketplace, and also make sure that any digitisation is targeted to a very sweet spot in terms of what the firm is about. So spending some time around the firm's purpose initially, and then spending some time around, where does that firm sit within the marketplace? So being very clear as to where we're pointing everybody in the organisation, and then being able to break that down, both in terms of purpose of the firm and the organisation, and being clear on what we do focus on and what we don't focus on. Equally important to know what you don't focus on, but also, a huge people piece in terms of linking that to personal values and harnessing that motivation in the organisation. A lot of organisation will augment their staff base in order to create that blueprint. Some of that is good, and there's an impetus of adding external expertise. But they really, the world-class organisations are the ones that are able to take a little bit of augmented external expertise, but unlock the potential of their colleagues within the organisation and really harness those two conversations together. Out of all that, it's broken down a lot more. If we went into more time, we'd go into more detail around it. But out of all that comes a set of structured conversations around where the value sits, and therefore what the architectural and organisational blueprint would be for any transformation. Getting that right means that you move from a state of activity-based conversations to very focused client-customer conversations with clear outcomes and an effective organisational structure as well, to be able to have small groups work on each of the sub-outcomes. So from a board and CEO perspective, very important to get that right, particularly if you want to move in a particular place in the marketplace. From a colleague perspective, also just such an empowering organisation when the CEO takes that leadership style and drives it through. And from an architectural and blueprint perspective, the folks really that know the organisation, understand the client and customer base, those are the ones that are really empowered. And typically in organisations, that's where you get a huge uplift in terms of the staff survey results. So in the organisations that I've worked in, where we adopt that approach, you get top quartile performance within the organisation and team.
I think that's really
just to build on that, if I may, Dax, it's really interesting kind of perspective, and I think one of the things I've certainly observed is that avoiding the trap of the ivory tower type syndrome, in that often when the architectural design component from a technology perspective is done and designed, if you don't sort of create these sort of mixed hybrid groups that are kind of co-designing, you can sometimes have a very detailed blueprint, but when you come to the execution, it doesn't quite sort of work in the same way. So there's that aspect of how do you bring sort of the development and the delivery aspect much closer to design is one sort of strand there. And I think the second, which I think Dax certainly touched on, is sort of almost also considering the organizational operating model, right? Because structures, incentives often drive behaviors. And as you're thinking about some of those design concepts, it's really critical to think about the operating model, because I think that fundamentally will then drive efficiency. And I think one of the things we touched on at the very start is that component of, does it stick and does it sustain and does it continue? And without the right sort of operating model design, you can have a beautiful blueprint. It's challenging to execute, but the structure isn't conducive for the execution aspect. And I think that's the other aspect of this that needs to be considered.
It's really interesting. I mean, I love the perspectives that you're bringing in here. And if I can just take the example of the Lego Group and where we are right now, because I think as an example of a lot of the discussions that we are having right now. So we are moving from being, you can say, I wouldn't say an old-fashioned, but we're a physical toy company. with brick and mortars and a physical experience for kids. With the pandemic, we moved tremendously into the direction of online. So over the past 2 or 3 years, our online channel has grown double digits for the past 3 years. But also, how can we infuse technology into our company? And that was actually a journey that started just slightly before the pandemic hit us. So we really want to become a digital consumer product company, delivering both the physical play experience as well as a digital experience. And the way that we coined that or framed that is, it's not just about technology and so forth, but it's really about introducing a whole new way of working. And for us, that led in the fall of last year into a complete transformation of our digital team. So moving into product-led organizations and much more autonomous working product teams. Of course, we had an architecture and we grouped products into what were the most, you can say, which products fit mostly together, and try to create that. But it's really a transformation on what we call on our consumers, so directly towards our end users, but also our customers, the middlemen, and not really to cut them out. And how can we ensure that they also have a technology that's available for them? It's really about our partners that help us in our production, in our supply chain. How can we involve them even more in our product development? And then it's of course also for all of our colleagues. How can we bring our colleagues up to speed and really do that? And so it's people, it's technology, and it's really having a really clear direction as to where we're going. But it's also I think we have a tendency really to fall in love with new technology and to try out and want to try out a lot of new stuff. And to your point, Senjuvan, on does it stick? I think, I mean, we're just 2 years down the line on this digital transformation. I think the real important and most challenging piece for us really is the mindset. So the mindset, not just of our digital colleagues in working with the business, but also in the business taking ownership of that digital transformation that's happening throughout the company. Because when we have digital product teams, that involves people from the business who take on product management leadership. And that is a new way of working. And for a traditional, still family, partly foundation-owned company, this whole agile way of working and being more flexible, and let's try out one technology, and if we fail, then we fail fast, and let's try something new. That whole mindset is definitely a challenge for us to step into. So for us, it's not so much the CDTO or the CEO direction setting and where we want to go, and that consumers are actually also following us on this journey. It's more of ourselves internally. How can we develop those competencies? How can we move our people from traditional on-prem big systems into more cloud-based systems, into being more agile in how we're developing and introducing new features that delight our customers and consumers. And I think that is for us the biggest hurdle right now on our transformation journey. That's really getting people along and installing that mindset of it's okay to fail.
And just to build on that a little bit, Thomas, it's some interesting points you've raised there, because I think certainly my observation in a lot of organizations is at the very top of the organization, you've got your board and the CEO that completely bought in. At the entry level of your organization, your Gen Zs, they rock up, they bring in the MacBook Pros, they want to, hack the APIs and, just ship the code, and they're really eager to go. And then you've got the messy middle, as I describe it, right? Which is, I think, what you were describing. And I think what's really key there, for certainly from my experience has been, is you've got to really think about the employee experience, your colleague experience of this change and transformation. So it doesn't feel like it's being done to them, but it's come from within. So you almost have to kind of walk their shoes to then understand kind of what the problem is from their perspective, and then take it from an employee experience. And I think that's a really kind of very design-led way to then bring this about, so that it does stick and it's driven from that messy middle.
I think on that, Senjuvan, I think there's often, as organizations go through transformation, there's often a focus first on the transforming the external the part that faces customers, that faces partners. And that, obviously that's important, right? That affects revenue, that affects your interaction with the market. But I think, as you said, the messy middle, and I like that. I'll be borrowing that. That's you need to bring all of your employees along for that ride. I think, Dax, you used the word purpose as well. They need to be bought into that purpose, but it needs to be more than just something on a PowerPoint slide or something that comes out occasionally in a pep talk or a speech. And I think they need to be part of that digital transformation as well, and given the tools so that they can feel engaged and be able to act in a more agile manner and engage differently with the other parts of their organization as well.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, if I can just to add one thing, I think to some extent we were helped by the pandemic, because it sort of forced us to reduce our long and winded decision-making processes and really cut down short and do things really fast. And one example was that we had a plan, a really just down practical example of, we wanted to do split delivery when someone was ordering from Amazon. Instead of sending it directly to a big central warehouse, we wanted to do it from our warehouse. And that was a project that was initially scheduled to be 6 to 9 months to carry out, and we did it in 3 months. Simply because the COVID and us going virtual, it sort of cut a lot of the red tape and started focusing in and honing in on, okay, we need to execute, because I mean, it was really a strange situation back in 2020 and around this time here, right? That we needed to take action, and we couldn't foresee the future. We just needed to execute on some of the things, and we were able to turn around. And what we saw during 2020, when I think that you referred to employee engagement and how motivated they actually are, is what we saw in our engagement surveys was that actually our employees, their engagement and motivation satisfaction was rising the first 3 to 6 months since we started lockdown in March of 2020. But then when we came back from the summer holidays, people were thinking, oh, now it had to be gone, right? But it wasn't. And they came back in September or in August of 2020 and saying, hey, so we're stuck at home. We're stuck with COVID. And we had a drop in our engagement with our employees as they adjusted to say, but this is not just a 3-month stint that we will do work at home. This is a prolonged thing. But I think some of the initiatives that we took actually ensured that we slided out on that dip in our motivation satisfaction, and actually got people back on board towards the end of 2020, and that carried out throughout 2021. But it was really, I think the pandemic both presented a huge opportunity, but also constraints on engagement of our staff.
So I think at this point we've certainly established that there's a lot that businesses or the industry can do in terms of in terms of making progress, building the right strategies, actually embedding it into their values, and getting the messy middle completely bought in, and things like that. But really a quick an important question here is that let's look also at the broader ecosystem, at regulation, the support that it can offer, the barriers that it might create, and kind of very curious, what is the role of regulation and ecosystem support in innovation and disruption? Maybe Jared, you could get us started on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Thomas made a point there about the pandemic being both a challenge and an opportunity. And I think the regulation and regulatory pressure can both be a challenge and an opportunity for businesses as well. We often see regulation as hurdles to innovation, but I think equally it can force innovation. It can force people to think differently about the challenges that they have. Like I'm speaking to a lot of my banking customers about some of the regulatory challenges they see from FINMA, from the FCA, and from others around end-of-life hardware and end-of-life software, and the huge technical debt that they have. So before they can start on some journey of transformation, they need to address some of those challenges. But the fact that they're being asked to address those challenges for security reasons, for risk reasons, means that it gives them the impetus to start on that change, right? It's another launch pad to get them looking at newer approaches to technology, newer ways to collaborate, newer ways to take advantage of services available from the cloud, the various clouds. I think as well, it's if they can work with their ecosystem partners, with the regulators, with their providers, with their vendors as well, they can help with overcoming some of those challenges. So, something that kind of cropped up in the last few years was concerns about concentration risk. So when cloud becomes, an outsource of almost all of your technology, how do you deal with the potential risks on that? And again, working closely with the regulators, working closely with the ecosystem partners in that space allows you to overcome that, allows you maybe to accelerate some of the adoption of those services and underpin some of those transformations. I think just finally, I think it's often just one small thing that can help with those challenges. I was at one particular banking customer, they said they would probably take 25 years to migrate all of their users to a particular set of cloud services. And that was based on the last time one particular user might leave the bank, because they had so much data that they didn't have the necessary classification. There's concerns about sovereignty, data permanence, all of that. But during the pandemic, again, which acted as a catalyst, they were forced to get out one other particular application, a messaging application out there. It brought the regulators together, their internal risk people together, and they were able to crack that one application because it was critical. And off the back of that, they were suddenly able to accelerate everything else. So sometimes that little bit of pressure can force people to concentrate, get the right people involved, get that purpose to get you over that hurdle, and then open up other opportunities as well.
I love those points, Gerald. And, centering again on purpose, but also you talk a lot around collaboration, and that's definitely key. And we've touched on lots of different stakeholder groups, whether that's, the employees that we have in the firms, or external regulators, et cetera. I mean, mindset wise, it's easy to potentially think because someone sits in a different legal entity that things are different, but actually the most effective organizations are able to catalyze those conversations and almost, while still sustaining the regulatory outcomes, take a collaboratory approach to those and really start to get the chemistry between, the capabilities of the regulators to make sure the standards are there and the external outcomes, and also making sure the detailed procedures are there, but also bringing that together with, colleagues in the organisation and starting to unlock some of that with the, a bit of alchemy, I guess, in a interesting sort of way to start to unlock, what people really understand. And the great thing about this is that all of us are customers or clients of organisations, so we can all relate to it in a really, really practical way. Whether it's the messy middle or not, I do believe having some of those conversations that are a little bit free flowing, but then start to structure it up a little bit, do get really interesting. And I think, Thomas, as well, you've made some sort of key points around how that also, creates speed to market when you have those different impetuses. I mean, certainly, at the time of the pandemic, I was working for an organisation called HSBC. We were able to get everybody working from home pretty much in a very, very short time period, and that's with over 200,000 people across the globe. The employee stats were very, very good, and that's because the pandemic, it was seen as an external piece that everybody had to deal with, and folks are very good at clubbing together in those things. So we actually saw a very positive benefit, and we also saw the technology area, the organisation start to step in further into the strategic conversations as a result. So some really, really interesting experiences.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think from my perspective, if we just take an HR perspective onto technology and regulations, we are predominantly concerned with GDPR regulations across the globe, and unfortunately, that differs a lot. So right now we're in the middle of moving from an SAP HR system into Workday cloud-based, and what we're experiencing is that It works well in Europe, to some extent also in the US, but when we start going to some of our Eastern European countries and certainly into China, they have completely different rules, and it's still messy, and they're introducing new laws, and how does that impact where we actually store the data? Can we just store it in the cloud in a data center in Dublin, or do we need to have a local cloud center in Shanghai or somewhere else? How long are we obliged by law to keep our data and report on it, and so forth and so forth? And that is I think to some extent, at least for both our consumer and customer, to extent quite a lot to our employee-facing applications and systems, that is a hindrance really for moving fast, because laws and right now they come in from left and right, and we don't know the impact yet. I mean, China just this year introduced a new privacy law, and we don't know yet the full impact of that, and whether we need to completely redesign a system that we haven't even launched yet. So regulations, fine. It would be great with a little bit more clarity on some of it, at least a direction. But again, I think the vendors that we have are also understanding of this, and try to come up with solutions as soon as they learn about new regulations. And of course, we rely heavily on our partners on that aspect. But opportunity, less so, I think, in terms of our case, and more a little bit of I wouldn't say a nuisance, but a hindrance to being compliant for us on that piece.
And I think just to build on that narrative slightly, and as you take a sort of a bit more of a macro step back and you think about things like ESG and some of these components, it feels like the way increasingly this is going to move towards is organizations that have a more defined purpose, especially across the stakeholder groups that they work within. That almost becomes the sort of the guiding principle around, as they define their purpose and that gets into their values, how they then decide to kind of interpret sort of a lot of the regulation, right? Because that at the end of the day, I think ultimately is where we'll get to, where organizations have a really clear purpose that's set out across all of their different stakeholder groups, right? So not just the city, if you're listed, but the environment you sit in, the ecosystem, your supply chain, all of those components. And then it feels like increasingly, when you look at boards and the remit of boards on a lot of these companies, is as they define the purpose and then execute that in terms of what does that mean for the culture of the organization, that becomes almost a guiding set of principles around how you then elect to sort of interpret a lot of the regulation, because a lot of it is open to interpretation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like that's the next sort of iteration of where this potentially might go, around how you then use that to then drive innovation and your innovation ethos.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah. Sorry.
no, I've just short comment. I think, Senjuvan, you're completely right. I mean, in response to that changed regulations in China, I mean, we created our local Chinese technology team based out of Shanghai, who will understand what is the environment and how can we adapt. And they, I wouldn't say they have a carte blanche to do whatever they want, but they need to work to make us compliant and utilize those, because it also presents a lot of opportunities, as you say, fully right on that, and it is up for interpretation. The Lego Group, however, is if this is the line, we would take rather 5 steps back from the line than trying to cross it. Simply, that's our nature.
I think just building on that a little, kind of going probably even further narrow. So one of the subsets of regulation per se. I mean, we've spoken about privacy regulations. We've spoken about regulations in other part of the world as well, and the inconsistency. But something that's been coming up a lot is the regulation of the more kind of emerging technologies, and the fact that this is imminent, and firms need to be preparing for it. And there are potential advantages of being compliant, or competitive advantages of being compliant even before the regulation hits us, because the costs of compliance post regulation become way higher than being able to foresee what's going on. So, very curious. Any perspectives on what firms can do to prepare for incoming or imminent regulation?
Maybe if I can take that one. I'm doing a lot of work in the fintech space at the moment, working with a variety of organisations. The one that there are a lot of very successful firms in there. The ones that are very, very successful are the ones that do not see a regulation as an external force. So it's about self-regulation. And if you conduct your firm and your business, whatever the size and shape of it, in a very ethical way, and you want to make sure that everything is correctly regulated and works well, because that gives the best client experience, and it makes sure that everybody is relaxed in their jobs. That's really important anyway. So starting from a point of self-regulation, and then, if I look at organizations, say organizations that work in the blockchain space or some other, as I say, distributed technologies, the ones that are very, very lead in the marketplace have already engaged with the regulators, but not in a command and control perspective at all. It's certainly not coming from that place. It's in a collaborative perspective to say we understand these new technologies, require a reinterpretation of legislation and how the regulation works, but we want to work together to understand how that works most effectively and really lead for the rest of the marketplace. And I take the example, from years back. I won't use a up to date one, but I'll use an old example, which is, years ago we wouldn't have thought about an electronic signature. An electronic signature would have broken everything because we need to have something written down at the very moment. We might scan it in, but that's kind of pushing the boundaries. And yet today, we've got electronic ways of signature. We've redefined the legislation so it allows for different forms of signature that are identifiable to the individual. And that has been done by small groups that have worked with the regulators and worked with interpretation, and also a lot of work with legal as well. So understanding that, underpinning that, and I don't underestimate the amount of conversations it takes to get everybody comfortable with that, because it requires a sign off across the functions. And Senjuvan, you've touched on kind of that enterprise view. That's an age old example, but there are many more up to date ones as well around that.
Just to build on something Dax said, actually, I think what's really interesting as a pattern now, as you look at cross sort of, NASDAQ listed companies and FTSE listed companies, is where historically you might have sort of general counsel and a compliance aspect. Increasingly now at a corporate governance level, you're now seeing kind of ethics boards or ethics committees that I think are then doing exactly as Dax said. They're more progressive in their thinking because they're trying to set the tone around sort of, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And how do you then establish that sort of ethics framework by which that is how the organization then governs or self-governs itself, which then I think can become quite a competitive differentiator because you're sort of codifying that in the culture of the organization. And that then helps to sort of almost help facilitate a lot of the decision making that then operates within the organizations. You drive sort of tighter cycles of innovation.
And I think to support that, like you're seeing the emergence of titles like Chief Trust Officer within organizations as well, right? And I think that's not just where previously it would have been, your external trust with your stakeholders, as you mentioned, Senjuvan, the city, your customers, your suppliers, but it's also internal trust within the organization as well, right? Are the things we're making claims around GSI and on DEI, are those claims, are we actually standing up to those claims as well and holding ourselves accountable?
I think there are also actually now a lot of resources that are being made available, especially by some of the larger enterprises of the world, in terms of what firms can do to install ethical reviews across every step of the technology planning, design, development, and implementation processes. To I believe there are a number of these frameworks available, and the idea then is that not only the firm but the industry can try to self-regulate, because um, one mistake anywhere in the industry can actually create a knock-on or a very negative ripple effect. But I think the last thing that would be amiss not to talk about, especially given what's happening today, is is getting the talent function right. Everyone's talking about the great resignation, particularly in the United States and Europe, and then knock on across other regions. Um, Historically high attrition rates, difficulties acquiring, retaining, cultivating talent, skill gaps, labor market challenges, so on and so forth. So I would, I'd love to hear your views on what it's going to actually take for firms to start to make progress on this front and get the talent function right, so to say. Thomas, maybe you want to get us started on this one.
Yeah, sure. I can also say we are at the Lego Group in a really fortunate situation that our turnover is 4, 5, 6%. So the Great Resignation that is happening in a lot of industries and a lot of countries, we haven't felt, you can say, the impact of that yet, and of course we hope not to have it. We added 10% to our total workforce last year, and we are aiming at adding another 2,000 people this year. A lot of it is in tech, to deliver on our transformation journey. And I think for us, we are carried when we look at why are new people wanting to join the Lego Group. And one, of course, the brand itself. It's a familiar brand, and people, candidates, identify with it. But when they come to learn us during the candidate process, and also speaking to people already working here, I think what they see and what is a big attraction from our side is the clear purpose that we have from our mission and the strategy and the actions that we are taking. So we are a family-owned, fourth-generation company. We will turn 100 years in 2032, with a very clear purpose on how we want to improve play and how children they play. And the candidates that we try to attract, they identify with that very clear purpose, and they see that the actions that we are taking, when we and not to piggyback on what's happening because it's a terrible situation, but when the foundation that owns a quarter of the company donates $100 million towards refugees and children from the Ukrainian war, I mean, they identify, okay, so there's a clear purpose, and I can see it through their actions. And when I start looking at how they're dealing with people, there's a very fine line there that we do our utmost really to connect the dots there and to keep that all aligned. And I think that is what we are looking at. However, we do have the challenge that we are located, I wouldn't say in rural Denmark, so in the small town of Billund, with about 10,000 employees, where we have our headquarters and we have our product development, we have our largest share of our digital developers. So we need to have the smart people relocate there. That's the challenge. And we are, of course, exploring our hubs both in Copenhagen and in London and elsewhere to open up for having more people in there. But it is a challenge for us, and you can say the challenge is further put on by the fact that we have chosen to believe in our offices and believe in a hybrid model. So we don't want to allow, you can say, fully remote work. We want people to meet up. Our whole DNA and our culture is very much based on the physical play and playing together, and that needs to come through. Otherwise, if you just work virtually and work on Teams or Zoom or whatever, you could work for any company, but you need to get that sense of what the company is really about, the culture. And that is, you can say, a challenge for us to attract people to some of the locations that we want to have them located in. But we're trying to, with all sorts of initiatives, to really do it. And so far we are, it takes time, but we're getting there and attracting and getting the people that we need to deliver on the transformation that we're working on.
And I would add into that very briefly, just to kind of say, culture first, strategy positions, but really culture wins. And I remember in one organisation that I worked with, it's actually a non-for-profit. I took 20 minutes to go and speak with the team. We had a community conversation. I was expecting lots of things that we needed to action as a leadership team, but the note I got in my inbox was, Dax, really, really appreciate you sharing your values, the firm's values, and taking time with us. And we would walk through walls for you. So the small things really do matter.
Mm.
I think just to build on that, I think that I'm not disputing anything that's been said, but there is something around the sort of the authenticity in which the organisation sort of manifests some of those values. And I think the ones that are really going to thrive in this next sort of period, as it were, are ones where you sort of you genuinely think about talent from the outside in. I think it's something that Dax mentioned earlier. So whereas historically before, organizations may have had certain constraints around how they're employing, either location or working hours and all those components, it feels like we're going to have to take a really kind of drains roots sort of upward sort of look at this and say, actually, let's take all of those constraints out for a moment. Let's really think about it from the eyes of the kind of prospective talent we're trying to attract. And I think one of the things certainly we've done as we're moving much more towards being the most flexible and inclusive employer in media is everything from, I guess, attraction and selection, and how do you do that, and how do you ensure that you're now looking at different sort of groups and ecosystems, so you tap into really diverse talent pools, through to onboarding. That almost is one of the most critical aspects, and onboarding starts really early on in the process. It's way before contract. It's sort of that very first interview. What's that experience like? And it is actually about the experience, because to Dax's point, that's when you get a sense for that authenticity. It's all very well having your values up on a poster and on PowerPoint slides and all the rest of it, but that first conversation you have, and the start of the conversation, the narrative and how you're treated as a potential talent, that's when you really sense the authenticity of the organization, and do those values really translate to everyone you're going to work. And then beyond the onboarding and induction, you then get into kind of well-being, right? So how do they think about that holistically in terms of mental health, and how's that sort of catered for and looked after? So it does feel like it has to be like a complete end to end. And taking that stage further, you think about sort of development for existing colleagues and upskilling, and how's that all thought through? And I think if we don't look at all of those component parts, I think it's very easy to sort of replicate the sort of, well, let's do work from anywhere in the world as a tactical knee-jerk reaction, but actually you've not thought about the whole piece. So it does seem to come back to that entire end-to-end experience, but getting out of yourselves within the organization and looking at it from the outside, and then following that experience all the way through.
Mm.
Yeah, I think some really good points in there, especially on the remote working one. It can't just become the most open plan office in the world. It has to be more than that, right? It has to be where's the right place for people to work. To Thomas's point, right? If you need people together in a room, if they need to be together for extended periods of time, that makes sense. But for other people, to allow that inclusivity, to give you the option to recruit people from different backgrounds with different capabilities, you need to have that hybrid model, and you need to be able to choose and mix and match what works best. And I think the other thing, just to pick up on the point Thomas made, was you mentioned how I think it was 2,000 new employees last year or this year, and they're mainly digital. I think that's one of the big challenges, right? Everyone is now recruiting from the same pool of people, right? Maybe 20, 25 years ago, bankers would recruit, or banks would recruit bankers, and manufacturers would recruit people with manufacturing background. But now there's a broad set of digital skills that everyone is trying to tap into. So again, being able to give that authentic experience, provide them with a business that has a sense of purpose and a set of values that match their own, that's going to be even more key. And being able to open up the opportunity for people to join that organization from different locations where it makes sense, that's going to be vital as well.
I think ending on a positive note, ending with a discussion about people. This was a wonderful session. Truly enlightening for me personally, and hopefully our audience enjoyed it as much. So, thank you so much to the panelists today. And yeah, thanks for your time.